Listen, I've been dead for over 200 years, and I can tell you something that would have saved me decades of wasted motion if someone had shaken me by the shoulders and said it plain. You think you're living different days, but you're not. You're performing the same day with minor variations, calling it a life, and wondering why nothing ever changes. I'm Benjamin Franklin, and before you dismiss this as the rambling of some old statesman in a wig, let me tell you, I wasn't born wise. I was born into a world that wanted to assign me a role and have me play it until death. And for too long, I did exactly that. I woke up, worked the same job, had the same conversations, nursed the same resentments, and fell asleep telling myself tomorrow would be different. It never was. Not until I understood something so simple it sounds stupid. Nothing changes until you change. Not your circumstances, not luck, not time. You. You've probably lived today before. Maybe not this exact day, but the pattern of it. You woke up the same way, looked at that glowing screen before your feet touched the floor, felt that familiar knot of dread or numbness, went through the motions of a morning you've performed 1,000 times, sat in the same mental fog, had the same internal arguments, avoided the same uncomfortable truths, and made the same promise that tomorrow, somehow, you'll do better. Tomorrow you'll start. Tomorrow you'll change. Tomorrow you'll become who you're supposed to be. Except tomorrow never comes. It's always today, and today looks suspiciously like yesterday. I know this pattern intimately because I lived it. When I was 17, working in my brother's print shop in Boston, I was miserable. My brother James was cruel, petty, and treated me like property. Every morning was the same grinding resentment. Every evening, the same bitter thoughts. I told myself I was trapped, that circumstances held me prisoner, that life had dealt me an unfair hand. I rehearsed my grievances like prayers, and nothing changed. Day after day after day, the same suffering, the same anger, the same helplessness. Until one night, setting type by candlelight, my hands black with ink, something cracked open inside me. I realized I was choosing this, not the circumstances, but my relationship to them. I was feeding my misery like a fire, adding logs of resentment and blame every single day, keeping it burning bright, and then wondering why I felt scorched. The next day, I made a different choice. Just one. Instead of arriving bitter and silent, I arrived early and organized the type cases without being asked. It was a tiny act, almost meaningless. But it was different. It broke the pattern, and in that break, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Agency. The sense that I was authoring my life rather than enduring it. Within weeks, I'd begun learning everything I could about printing, writing, philosophy, and science. Within months, I'd saved enough to leave Boston entirely. I ran away to Philadelphia with nothing but a few coins, and an understanding that had rearranged my entire existence. The life you have is the life you build, one small choice at a time, and most people never build anything because they're too busy repeating yesterday. So let me ask you directly, what are you repeating? What pattern are you performing without questioning? What invisible script are you reading from, day after day, wondering why the story never changes? Because here's what I learned through decades of living, experimenting, failing, and occasionally succeeding. Most people are not living lives. They're living loops. And the truly haunting part is, they don't even know it. They think variation in surface details means they're moving forward. New relationship, same dynamics. New job, same complaints. New city, same internal weather. They're like someone rearranging furniture in a burning house, believing they're making progress. I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to tell you what I wish someone had told me before I wasted years of irreplaceable life on automatic repetition. I'm here to show you how to see the loop you're in, how to break it, and how to start actually living before you run out of time. Because you are running out of time. We all are. That's not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you up. Every repeated day is a day you don't get back. Every pattern you run unconsciously is writing the story of your life. And most people discover far too late that they've written the same chapter over and over, calling it a book. Let me show you how to write something new, something true, something yours. But first, we need to understand exactly how you got trapped in this loop and why it feels so impossibly hard to escape. We need to look at the machinery of repetition that runs your life without your consent, because you cannot change what you cannot see. I spent 50 years studying human nature, including my own, And I can tell you that the repetition trap has three essential components working together to keep you stuck. Think of them as three invisible chains. Most people spend their entire lives bound by these chains without ever seeing them clearly enough to break free. The first chain is unconscious identity. You have a story about who you are, built from old experiences, other people's opinions, failures you've internalized, and roles you've been assigned. This story runs in the background like a program, making decisions for you, filtering what you notice, and determining what seems possible. And here's the cruel part. You defend this story, even when it makes you miserable, because it's familiar. The devil you know feels safer than the uncertainty of becoming someone new. When I was young, my story was, I'm the younger brother, the one without formal education, the one who has to accept whatever position is offered, the one who isn't quite good enough to determine his own course. This story was built from my father's disappointment that he couldn't afford to keep me in school, my brother's constant criticism, and the class distinctions of Boston society. And I acted from this story every single day, making choices that confirmed it, avoiding opportunities that might contradict it, staying small to match the shape of the identity I'd been given. Your unconscious identity might sound like, I'm not the kind of person who succeeds at that. I'm not creative. I'm not brave. I'm not smart enough. I'm not disciplined. I'm someone who always ends up disappointed. I'm someone people leave. I'm someone who has to struggle. These aren't truths. They're stories you've confused with truth. And they will run your life perfectly, consistently, predictably, keeping you in the same patterns, until you see them clearly and decide to write something different. The second chain is habit automation. Your brain is brilliantly designed to turn repeated actions into automatic programs that run without conscious thought. This is useful when you're learning to walk or speak, or tie your shoes. It's devastating when you automate patterns that don't serve you, and then live on autopilot for decades. Most of your day, you're not actually present. You're running programs. The way you wake up, the thoughts you think in the shower, the route you drive, the way you respond to certain people, the things you eat, the ways you avoid discomfort, the entertainment you use to numb out, the arguments you have, the excuses you make. All automated, all unconscious, all repeated so many times they've carved grooves in your brain deeper than rivers. I discovered this when I tried to break my habit of argumentativeness. I thought I was simply responding rationally to foolish ideas, but when I started paying attention, I realized I was running a program. Someone would state an opinion, and before I'd even fully heard it, my machinery of contradiction was already assembling a rebuttal. It was automatic. It had nothing to do with truth-seeking, and everything to do with a repeated pattern I'd never questioned. When I finally decided to change this, I created a system. I would remain silent when I felt the urge to argue, just for a moment, just long enough to actually hear what was being said and choose my response rather than defaulting to the program. It was astonishingly difficult at first. The automation wanted to run, but gradually, by interrupting it again and again, I created a different pattern. I became someone who listened curiously, rather than argued reflexively, and this single change transformed my relationships, my learning, my entire way of moving through the world. What habits are running you? Not just the obvious ones like checking your phone or having a drink, or putting things off, but the deeper programs, the habit of defensive reactions, the habit of self-criticism, the habit of playing small, the habit of envying others while doing nothing yourself, the habit of waiting for permission, the habit of making yourself busy so you don't have to face what matters. These invisible habits are authoring your life, and most people never interrupt them even once. The third chain is fear of uncertainty. Human beings crave predictability. Your nervous system is wired to prefer a known negative over an unknown possibility. This kept your ancestors alive, but it's keeping you trapped. Because breaking the loop means stepping into uncertainty, and your entire system is designed to resist that. Staying in the same pattern, even if it makes you miserable, feels safe. It's predictable. You know how to navigate it. You know who you are within it. Changing means you don't know what will happen. You don't know who you'll be. You don't know if you'll succeed or fail. And faced with that uncertainty, most people choose the familiar cage every single time. I felt this viscerally when I was deciding to leave Boston. I had a predictable life there, even if it was miserable. I knew the streets, the people, my role, and what to expect. Leaving meant complete uncertainty. I'd be alone in a strange city with almost no money, no connections, no safety net. Every part of me wanted to stay in the known. But I went anyway, because I understood something crucial. The illusion of safety and repetition is costing you the only life you have. The real risk isn't uncertainty. The real risk is reaching the end of your life and realizing you never lived it. You just repeated a small, scared version of it over and over until time ran out. These three chains work together, reinforcing each other, creating a prison so subtle you mistake it for reality. Your unconscious identity tells you who you are, which determines your habits, which create predictable results, which confirm your identity, which reinforces your habits, which keeps you in the known. Around and around, the same day, forever. But here's what I learned, what I proved through the entire arc of my life. These chains can be broken, not easily, not overnight, but absolutely, completely, permanently. And it starts with the one thing most people never do, actually looking at the pattern clearly enough to see it for what it is. Let me tell you about a Wednesday in 1726 that looked exactly like every other Wednesday I'd experienced in London. I was 20 years old, working for a printer named Palmer, and I was slowly disappearing into a life I hadn't chosen and didn't want. Every morning the same. Wake in a cold room, eat bread and weak beer, walk through gray streets to the printing house, set type for 12 hours, drink in the evening with men who talked endlessly about nothing, return to my room, collapse, repeat, day after day, week after week. I told myself I was building skills, making connections, preparing for some future moment when life would actually begin. But the truth I was avoiding was simpler and more terrifying. This was my life. It was already happening, and I was sleepwalking through it. One particular Wednesday, I was setting type for a religious tract, the kind of moralizing text I'd set hundreds of times. And something about the repetition of it, the physical act of placing the same letters in the same configurations to print the same dead words that would be read by people living the same dead patterns, broke something open in me. I stopped, put down the composing stick, and looked at my hands. They were stained black with ink, the creases of my palms filled with darkness like a map of accumulated days. And I thought, is this what I'm doing with my time on Earth? Repeating someone else's words, living someone else's idea of a life, moving through days like a clockwork mechanism that never questions its programming? I left the shop that night and walked for hours through London, and I made a decision that changed everything. Not a dramatic decision, not some grand transformation. Just this. I would start paying attention. I would watch my own life like a scientist observing an experiment. I would see my patterns clearly, write them down, examine them honestly, and consciously choose what to keep and what to abandon. I bought a small notebook, started tracking everything. When I woke, what I did, what I thought, what I avoided, how I spent money, what I learned, what I wasted time on, what emotions arose, and why. I wasn't judging it, just seeing it, and what I saw shocked me. I was performing endlessly the same day, endlessly. Same morning thoughts, mostly anxious and scattered. Same way of moving through work, competent but disconnected. Same evening pattern of distraction and mild intoxication. Same conversations, same complaints, same promises to myself that I never kept. I was like an actor who'd been playing the same role for so long that I'd forgotten it was a performance. The mask had become my face. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living inauthentically. It's not the tiredness you feel after a hard day's work that's honest fatigue, earned, and satisfying. No, this was the bone-deep weariness of constantly maintaining a fiction. Every interaction required me to remember my lines, to stay in character, to suppress the growing suspicion that I was wasting the only life I'd ever get. I remember standing in my bathroom one Tuesday morning, toothbrush in hand, staring at my reflection. And for just a moment, maybe 3, 4 seconds, I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music swelled. No revelation struck like lightning. Just this quiet, disturbing sense that somewhere between childhood dreams and adult compromises, I'd become a stranger to myself. The Greeks had a word for this. Akrasia times, acting against your better judgment. Knowing what you should do but doing the opposite anyway. Aristotle wrote about it. So did Plato. They understood that humans possess this bizarre capacity for self-sabotage, this ability to see the right path clearly and then deliberately walk in the wrong direction. I was a master of acrasia. I knew I should exercise, but I'd skip the gym. I knew I should save money, but I'd order takeout. I knew I should pursue meaningful work, but I'd scroll through job listings and then close the tab. And the worst part? I'd convince myself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, I'd be the person I was supposed to be. Tomorrow, I'd finally get my act together. But tomorrow kept becoming today, and today kept becoming yesterday, and nothing ever changed. Here's what nobody tells you about comfort zones. They're not actually comfortable. They're just familiar. There's a difference. A comfort zone is like an old pair of shoes that don't fit right. They pinch and rub and give you blisters. But you keep wearing them because at least you know exactly where they're going to hurt. The unknown might be better, probably would be better, but it might also be worse. And that possibility is enough to keep you limping along in shoes that are slowly destroying your feet. I've watched people do this their entire lives. Stay in jobs they despise because at least the misery is predictable. Remain in relationships that stopped feeling like love years ago because loneliness seems scarier than being lonely while sitting next to another person. Live in places they've outgrown, surrounded by people who knew them when, who hold them to an outdated version of themselves like museum curators protecting an artifact. The question that haunts me is this: when did we start believing that certainty was more valuable than possibility? Because that's the trade we're making. We're trading the possibility of something extraordinary for the certainty of something barely tolerable. It's like refusing to bet on yourself, even when the house odds are terrible. I knew a woman once brilliant, creative, full of ideas that could have changed her entire industry. She worked for a company that treated her like a cog in a machine that was already obsolete. They underpaid her, overlooked her, and took credit for her innovations. But she stayed. 23 years she stayed. You know what she told me when I asked why? "Better the devil you know," she said. As if staying with a devil was somehow the smart choice just because you'd memorized his routines. The tragedy isn't even that she stayed. The tragedy is what happened to her mind, her spirit, over those years. When you spend decades convincing yourself that you can't leave, you eventually stop being able to imagine leaving. The prison becomes mental long before it's circumstantial. Your imagination atrophies like a muscle you never use. You forget how to dream up alternatives. This is how people wake up at 50, 60, 70, and realize they've been living someone else's life, or worse, a life no one would have chosen, a default setting that ran on autopilot while they were busy being afraid. The comfort zone doesn't just hold you in place. It shrinks around you, year by year, like a sweater thrown in hot water. What felt spacious at 25 feels suffocating at 35, but you've adjusted to the constriction so gradually you barely notice until you can't breathe at all. I've watched this contraction happen to countless people. They start their careers willing to speak up in meetings, pitch bold ideas, and take on challenging projects. Then one day, maybe after a criticism that stung, maybe after watching someone else fail publicly, they decide it's safer to stay quiet. Just this once. Just until things settle down. But things never settle down. And that single decision becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes their identity. By the time they're mid-career, they've built an entire life around avoiding the very challenges that would have made them exceptional. The cruel mathematics of the comfort zone work against you exponentially. Each year you spend in it, the gap between where you are and where you could have been grows wider. Not linearly, exponentially. The person who pushed through discomfort 5 years ago isn't just 5 years ahead of you. They're living in a completely different reality, one you can barely recognize from your vantage point. And here's what really keeps people trapped. The comfort zone offers you just enough. Just enough money to pay your bills with a little left over. Just enough recognition to feel not entirely invisible. Just enough challenge to tell yourself you're still growing. It's the just enough that kills ambition more effectively than outright failure ever could. Because failure at least gives you information. It tells you what doesn't work, which is infinitely more valuable than never knowing what might work. But just enough gives you nothing, except the slow erosion of your potential, wrapped in the convenient lie that you're being reasonable, practical, smart even. I see people justify this imprisonment with the language of wisdom. I'm being realistic, they say. I have responsibilities. I can't take risks anymore, as if responsibility and growth were somehow opposed to each other. as if the greatest risk isn't becoming someone who settled for less than they were capable of becoming. I've seen people build entire fortresses of justification around their inaction. They construct elaborate philosophies about contentment, about being grateful for what you have, about not being materialistic or ambitious. And yes, gratitude matters. Contentment has its place. But there's a vast difference between genuine peace and sophisticated resignation. The truly content person radiates possibility. They're not defending their choices, they're living them with full conviction. They don't need to convince you or themselves that their path is right. But the person who's settled? They're always explaining, always justifying, always pointing out the flaws in what others are doing, because seeing others pursue growth reminds them of what they've abandoned in themselves. I spent 3 years in what I called a stable situation. Good salary, predictable rhythms, a title that sounded impressive at dinner parties. And I told myself I was being smart, being mature, being realistic. Until one morning, I caught myself actively hoping a colleague's new initiative would fail. Not because I disliked him, but because his ambition made me uncomfortable with my own stagnation. That moment of self-awareness was devastating and liberating in equal measure. We don't resent people for failing. We resent them for trying, because their trying holds up a mirror to our not trying. Their reaching exposes our settling. Their growth highlights our stagnation. And here's what nobody tells you about settling. It's not a moment. It's not a single decision where you throw up your hands and say, "This is good enough." It's 1,000 tiny compromises that compound over time. It's 1 year of not learning that new skill. Then another. It's 1 opportunity you don't pursue. Then 10 more. It's 1 conversation where you don't speak your truth. Then 100 more. Before you know it, you've built an entire life around what you didn't do. And the weight of all those accumulated non-decisions becomes so heavy that taking any action feels impossible. You've invested so much time in your current path that changing course would mean admitting those years were, perhaps, a detour rather than a destination. I've watched this phenomenon across centuries now, and here's what strikes me most. The mathematics of regret work exponentially, not linearly. Miss 1 day at the printing press, and tomorrow's work absorbs it easily. Miss 1 week, and you're explaining gaps to customers. Miss 1 month, and your reputation begins to crack. Miss 1 year, and you're rebuilding from ashes. The cost compounds like interest on a debt you never meant to accrue. You see, there's a particular torture in knowing exactly what you should be doing while actively choosing to do something else. When I was establishing the first subscription library in America, there were countless evenings I could have spent drinking ale with friends at the tavern, and believe me, the temptation was real. Those men seemed happy enough, laughing about nothing, solving no problems. But I knew something they didn't. The temporary comfort of avoiding meaningful work creates a permanent discomfort with yourself. The voice of distraction speaks in your own tone, which makes it devastatingly effective. It doesn't sound like an enemy. It sounds like a friend offering perfectly reasonable advice. You've worked hard enough today. You deserve this break. You'll feel more motivated tomorrow. And these statements aren't even lies, they're just strategically deployed truths. Yes, you do deserve rest. But do you deserve rest from work you haven't actually done? That's the question that haunts you at 3 in the morning when sleep won't come. I remember Benjamin Lay, the radical Quaker who lived in a cave to protest slavery. People thought him mad, and perhaps he was, but he had something most never achieve: perfect alignment between belief and action. No gap, no hesitation, no tomorrow. Whatever you thought of his methods, you couldn't accuse him of postponing his principles. Most of us aren't postponing anything so dramatic, we're just putting off the person we promised ourselves we'd become. I've watched men make the same bargain for decades. 1 more year at the job they hate. 1 more season before they start that project. 1 more month before they have the difficult conversation. They call it patience. They call it waiting for the right moment. But I learned something in my printing shop that most people never grasp: there is no such thing as the right moment. There's only the moment you decide to act, and that decision transforms ordinary time into the right time. Let me tell you about a woman I never met, but whose story reached me through letters and newspapers. Her name was Elizabeth Blackwell, and she wanted to become a physician at a time when the very idea was considered absurd. Every medical school in America rejected her, 29 of them. Most people would have called that a sign. Most would have said the universe was speaking. that perhaps she should pursue something more appropriate, more realistic. But Elizabeth understood something that eludes most. Rejection isn't the universe speaking. It's just people speaking. And people are often wrong. The 30th school accepted her, allegedly because the students thought her application was a joke and voted to admit her as a prank. She graduated first in her class. Think about that. The entire medical establishment told her no, and she became their finest student. What if she had listened to voice number 23? Or voice number 27? What if she had decided that 29 rejections were enough evidence that she should give up? This is what discipline looks like in its purest form. Not the ability to push forward when you feel motivated, but the capacity to continue when every external indicator suggests you should stop. It's easy to persist when you're winning. The true test comes when you're losing, when the scoreboard shows nothing but zeros, when every rational voice says retreat. I've seen this pattern repeat throughout history, across every field of human endeavor. The difference between those who achieve lasting significance and those who fade into obscurity isn't talent. It's the willingness to continue when continuation seems pointless. Thomas Edison didn't succeed because his first 100 attempts at the light bulb showed promise. He succeeded because he continued after the first 100 failures revealed nothing but what wouldn't work. Consider the mathematics of persistence. Most people quit after the first major setback. A smaller group continues through the second. By the third significant failure, the crowd has thinned dramatically. This is precisely why those who refuse to quit often succeed, not because they're inherently superior, but because they've outlasted the competition. Victory frequently belongs not to the strongest but to the most stubborn. But let me be clear about something crucial. Continuing doesn't mean repeating the same failed approach indefinitely. That's not persistence, that's foolishness. True discipline includes the wisdom to adapt while maintaining direction. When I conducted my experiments with electricity, each failure taught me something. I adjusted my methods, refined my hypotheses, and modified my equipment. The goal remained constant. The approach evolved. This is where many misunderstand the nature of disciplined effort. They confuse rigidity with consistency. Discipline isn't about being inflexible. It's about being unmovable in your commitment while remaining completely flexible in your tactics. The ship's captain doesn't abandon the destination. When storms arise, he adjusts the sails, changes the route, and navigates around the obstacle. The destination remains fixed. The path adapts to reality. I learned this lesson not in the halls of Congress or the courts of Europe, but in my print shop, ink under my fingernails, deadline looming like a creditor at the door. I had committed to publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette every week, without fail. That was my discipline, my non-negotiable standard. But the how? That changed constantly. One week, my lead supplier disappeared. Another week, half my staff fell ill with fever. There were weeks when breaking news demanded we scrap the entire front page hours before printing. I could have said, "My process is disrupted, therefore my commitment is void." Instead, I said, "My commitment stands, now what must change?" I found new suppliers. I worked through the night alone when necessary. I rewrote articles in minutes that would normally take hours. The newspaper is published on schedule every single week. Not because my circumstances were favorable, but because my discipline was adaptable. This is where most people stumble. They build their entire sense of discipline around a specific routine, a particular set of circumstances, a comfortable environment. Then life disrupts that routine, as life always does, and they mistake the disruption of method for permission to abandon the mission. You tell yourself you can only write in the morning with your special coffee at your designated desk. Then life throws a sick child, an early meeting, a broken coffee maker into your path. And suddenly you don't write at all. Your discipline wasn't actually discipline. It was dependency on perfect conditions. True discipline writes on the train, in the waiting room, on the back of an envelope at midnight. The commitment to write remains constant. Everything else is negotiable. I see this confusion everywhere. The person who can only exercise at their particular gym then quits entirely when they move across town. The entrepreneur who can only be productive with their ideal team then collapses when key people leave. The artist who can only create in their studio then produces nothing when circumstances force them elsewhere. They've confused the scaffold with the building. Discipline is the building, permanent, structural, foundational. Your methods are merely scaffolding, temporary supports that should be dismantled and rebuilt as needed. When you make the scaffolding sacred, you trap yourself. When you keep only the foundation sacred, you become unstoppable. I learned this through printing, of all things. When I first arrived in Philadelphia with barely a coin in my pocket, I thought the London method of typesetting was gospel. It was what I'd been taught, what I'd practiced, what I knew. But Philadelphia wasn't London. The climate was different. Humidity affected the paper differently. The clientele was different. They wanted different formats, different turnaround times. The very rhythm of commerce was different. I had a choice: cling to the London method as sacred, or cling to the goal producing excellent printed material efficiently as sacred, and adapt everything else. I chose adaptation. I rearranged my workshop. I modified my techniques. I experimented with different paper treatments. Some printers in town mocked me for abandoning proper methods. But within 2 years, I had the most successful print shop in Philadelphia. The sacred thing wasn't the method. It was the excellence of the outcome. Years later, I watched the same principle apply to something far more consequential: the drafting of our Constitution. We could have made the British parliamentary system sacred after all. It had centuries of tradition. We could have made the Articles of Confederation sacred. We'd just fought a war under them. Instead, we made the principles sacred: representation, liberty, checks on power. And we built an entirely new structure to honor those principles. We borrowed from Rome, from the Iroquois Confederacy, from Enlightenment philosophy, from our own colonial experiments. We created something unprecedented because we refused to confuse the container with the content. This is where most people stumble in their own lives. They experience success using a particular approach, and they canonize that approach. The method becomes their identity. They become the person who wakes at 5 a.m., the person who journals daily, the person who networks aggressively. And when life changes, when children arrive, when health shifts, when markets transform, they break. Because they've tied their identity to scaffolding rather than a foundation. Let me be direct about what stays sacred: your core principles, your deepest values, your fundamental commitments. These are your constitution. Everything else, every habit, every routine, every technique, these are merely legislation. They can and should be amended when circumstances demand it. And circumstances, my dear friends, always demand adaptation. You see, I've watched men cling to failing strategies like drowning sailors to driftwood. They confuse stubbornness with consistency. They mistake rigidity for discipline. But there's a profound difference between abandoning your principles and adjusting your methods. When I first established my printing business, I had a rule: work from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, without exception. That was my legislation. It served me well for years. But then I noticed something curious. My best ideas, my clearest thoughts, never came during those long hours at the press. They came during my morning walks. They came while I was reading. They came in moments of leisure. So I amended my legislation. I shortened my working hours. I made time for what I called intellectual recreation. My productivity didn't decrease, it exploded. Because I had maintained my constitution excellence in my craft while updating the legislation that governed how I pursued it. This is what most people get backwards. They hold rigidly to their methods while letting their principles drift. They say, I must exercise at 6 a.m. every day, and when life makes that impossible, they exercise not at all. The legislation has become their master. But the wise person says, I am committed to maintaining my health. That's the Constitution. And then they ask, what methods best serve that commitment given my current circumstances? That's flexible legislation. I've seen this principle play out across every domain of human endeavor. The successful merchant doesn't cling to a single trade route. When wars close it, he finds another way to move his goods. The successful politician doesn't repeat the same speech. When the audience has changed, he adapts his message while keeping his purpose. Your life will throw you chaos. Markets will crash. Health will falter. Relationships will end. Technologies will render your skills obsolete. These are not failures, they're amendments to your legislation waiting to be written. The question is, do you know your Constitution well enough to rewrite your laws without losing yourself? Here's the truth that haunts the ambitious. Change is a paradox that will test your identity at its core. On one hand, you must be flexible enough to bend with the winds of circumstance. But bend too far, and you snap not physically, but psychologically. You lose the thread of who you were meant to become. I've watched this play out countless times. A young merchant arrives in Philadelphia, with fire in his belly and principles carved in stone. "I will never compromise my values," he declares. 5 years later, he's cutting corners, justifying small betrayals, telling himself each compromise is necessary for survival. He adapted, yes, but he adapted himself into someone he no longer recognizes in the mirror. Then there's the opposite extreme, the craftsman who refuses every innovation, who insists the old ways are the only ways. "I will not change," he proclaims with pride. Meanwhile, the world flows around him like water around a stubborn rock. Eventually, he finds himself obsolete, angry, and bewildered by a world that moved on without his permission. Both failed the same test. They didn't understand that successful adaptation requires a core that doesn't adapt. Think of it this way. I changed my opinions about governance, about science, about religion itself over my lifetime. But there were non-negotiables I carried from Boston to Philadelphia to London to Paris: integrity in work, service to community, relentless curiosity, the belief that improvement was always possible. These were my Constitution's preamble. Everything else was subject to amendment. You need this distinction desperately in our current age. The world will pressure you to change everything about yourself, your beliefs, your standards, your definition of success. It comes disguised as wisdom. Be practical, they'll say. Be realistic. Everyone does it this way now. And perhaps they're right about the methods. But if you're not careful, you'll change not just how you do things, but why you do them. The transformation happens in increments so small, you'd never notice them in isolation. One day, you're a writer who loves the craft of finding the perfect word. Next, you're optimizing for algorithmic keywords. One day, you're an artist, exploring your vision. Next, you're A/B testing thumbnails to see which emotion drives more clicks. And here's what makes it so insidious: each compromise makes perfect sense. Of course, you should use keywords that help people find your work. Of course, you should care whether people actually click on what you create. These aren't betrayals of your values. They're just smart adaptations to how the system works. But intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. I learned this distinction while running a print shop. Smart printers could calculate profit margins down to the penny. They knew every shortcut, every way to maximize throughput. But the wise printers understood something deeper: that a reputation built over years could be destroyed in moments by one rushed job, one compromised standard, one decision made purely for efficiency rather than excellence. The smart move often wins the day. The wise move wins the decade. Today's creators face this same tension, amplified 1,000-fold by algorithmic systems that reward optimization above all else. And I watch with a kind of sad fascination as brilliant people slowly transform themselves into content machines, producing endless streams of material perfectly calibrated to platform preferences, yet somehow emptied of the very qualities that made them worth following in the first place. They haven't failed. By many metrics, they've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Millions of followers, brand partnerships, revenue streams, all the markers of modern creative success. But somewhere along the way, the person who started this journey, the one with something urgent to say, something only they could express in quite that way, that person has been quietly edited out of the story. Not deleted entirely, just refined, optimized, made more palatable, more predictable, more platform-friendly. And they tell themselves this is just professionalism. This is just learning the craft. This is just growing up and understanding how things actually work. But here's what I learned from watching thousands fail. Professionalism without principles is just prostitution with better branding. You want to know what real professionalism looks like? Real professionalism is doing excellent work while keeping your soul intact. Real professionalism is understanding the system well enough to navigate it without becoming it. Real professionalism is saying, I will deliver outstanding results, but I will not compromise on these specific things. I've watched this play out in fascinating ways. There's a content creator I know who built an audience of 500,000 people talking about sustainable living. Then a major fast fashion brand offered her a sponsorship deal worth more than she'd made in the previous year combined. She turned it down. Her team thought she was insane. Nobody will know, they said. Everyone does it, they said. You can donate some of the money to environmental causes to balance it out, they said. She posted about turning down the deal, explained why it contradicted everything she stood for. That single post got more engagement than anything she'd done in months. Within weeks, 3 different sustainable brands reached out with smaller but aligned partnership opportunities. Within a year, her income had doubled, but more importantly, her audience trusted her in a way that transcended typical influencer relationships. The market rewards integrity more than we think. Not always immediately, not always obviously, but consistently over time. Here's what the compromisers don't tell you. Every compromise makes the next one easier. Every time you tell yourself, just this once, you're training yourself to accept just this once as a way of life. You take the sponsorship that doesn't quite align with your values. Then you adjust your content slightly to please an advertiser. Then you avoid topics that might upset potential sponsors. Then you're creating content designed primarily to be advertiser-friendly rather than audience-valuable. And one day you wake up and realize you've built a profitable business around content you don't even care about anymore. For an audience you've subtly trained to expect the version of you that isn't really you. The question isn't whether compromises happen. They do. The question is whether you're compromising toward your vision or away from it. There's a difference between adapting your path and abandoning your destination. When I spent those years in London, representing colonial interests to a government that barely pretended to listen, I had to compromise constantly. Which arguments to make, which officials to approach, which battles to fight today, and which to save for tomorrow. But every compromise was tactical, not philosophical. I bent on method while holding firm on principle. I adjusted the route while keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon. That's the art. Knowing which foundations cannot shift, and which walls can be rebuilt. I've watched brilliant people destroy themselves through inflexibility, refusing to adjust when circumstances changed, clinging to plans that no longer served their purpose simply because they'd invested too much pride in them. But I've also watched promising people lose themselves through endless accommodation, compromising on this small thing, then that one, then another, until one day they look up and realize they're building someone else's dream in a language they no longer recognize. The ones who succeeded, the ones whose work actually changed the world, possessed something I can only describe as flexible integrity. They held their core vision sacred while remaining ruthlessly pragmatic about everything else. Take the Constitution. That document exists only because 55 men agreed to compromise on nearly everything except the fundamental premise that free people could govern themselves. We fought over representation, over slavery, over the balance of power. We gave ground. We found middle paths. We swallowed disappointments. But we never compromised on the central idea. We never said, perhaps we should just accept monarchy with better manners. That's the question you must ask yourself when someone demands a compromise. Are they asking me to adjust how I reach my destination? Or are they asking me to choose a different destination entirely? One is negotiation. The other is surrender. And here's what makes this particularly difficult in the modern age. You're surrounded by voices telling you that any boundary is stubbornness, any standard is elitism, any refusal is closed-mindedness. They'll call you inflexible for having principles. They'll call you difficult for maintaining standards. They'll suggest that your unwillingness to compromise on core values is what's holding you back from success. But here's what I learned through decades of building, creating, and standing firm. The people who call you inflexible are usually the ones who've compromised themselves into irrelevance. The ones who label you difficult are typically those who took the easy path and now resent you for choosing the hard one. Real success, the kind that lasts, the kind that means something isn't built on flexibility, it's built on principles so solid that nothing can shake them. When I published Poor Richard's Almanac, I could have bent to popular opinion. I could have printed the kind of shallow entertainment that sold easily. I could have avoided controversial topics, played it safe, and kept everyone comfortable. That would have been the flexible approach. Instead, I printed truths that needed to be said. Some people loved it. Many people hated it. But it mattered. It lasted. People still quote those words centuries later, not because I was flexible, but because I wasn't. The same with my scientific work. When I proposed my theories about electricity, the established academics called me difficult, unqualified, presumptuous. A printer dabbling in natural philosophy? How dare I challenge their domain? I could have backed down. I could have apologized for overstepping my station. I could have been more flexible in my approach, more deferential to their authority. But I knew what I'd observed. I knew what the experiments proved. So I stood firm, published my findings, and let the work speak for itself. Eventually, even the Royal Society had to acknowledge the truth. Here's the reality that nobody wants to tell you. Being called difficult is often a sign that you're doing something right. It means you're not rolling over. It means you're not making other people's lives easier at the expense of your own integrity. The world doesn't need more people who bend with every wind. It needs people who stand like oak trees rooted so deeply that storms only make them stronger. And yes, standing firm costs you something. It cost me friendships. It cost me opportunities. It cost me the approval of people whose approval would have made certain paths easier. But you know what it gave me? Self-respect. Genuine accomplishments. Relationships built on truth rather than convenience. A legacy that mattered. I began to see that true contentment wasn't found in grand achievements but in small, consistent choices. Each morning became an opportunity to choose substance over show. Each conversation became a chance to practice authenticity rather than performance. The workshop taught me something unexpected. People actually prefer dealing with someone real. My customers, it turned out, didn't need me to be exceptional. They needed me to be honest about delivery times, to admit when I'd made an error, to charge fairly, and work diligently. One client told me something I've never forgotten. "Benjamin," he said, "I don't come to you because you're the finest printer in Philadelphia. I come because when you say something will be done on Tuesday, it's done on Tuesday. When you quote a price, that's the price I pay. In a world full of grand promises and disappointing results, that reliability is worth more than brilliance." That observation transformed how I viewed my entire existence. I had been chasing extraordinary when ordinary excellence was what the world actually needed. I had been performing complexity when simple consistency was what people valued. I started applying this principle everywhere. In my friendships, I stopped trying to be the most entertaining person at every gathering. Instead, I focused on being present, on listening genuinely, on remembering what mattered to others. Surprisingly, my friendships deepened rather than diminished. In my learning, I stopped hoarding impressive facts to deploy in conversation. Instead, I studied what genuinely interested me, what could improve my craft, and what might serve my community. The knowledge I gained became useful, rather than decorative. Even in public service, for I had begun involving myself in civic matters, I learned to focus on tangible improvements rather than impressive proposals. A lending library that actually circulated books mattered more than an elaborate academy that existed mainly on paper. A volunteer fire company that showed up to fires outweighed a complex municipal reform plan that no one would implement. This shift didn't make me less ambitious. If anything, it clarified my ambitions. I wanted to build things that worked, not things that impressed. I wanted to create value that persisted, not recognition that faded. I wanted to be useful rather than celebrated, though I wouldn't have minded if usefulness eventually brought some celebration along with it. The paradox, of course, was that this focus on substance over show actually brought more recognition than my previous posturing ever had. When you consistently deliver value without constantly advertising it, people notice. They tell others. Your reputation builds on the solid foundation of repeated experience rather than the shifting sand of clever marketing. And here's what most people miss about reputation building: it compounds. Every satisfied customer becomes a living advertisement. Every problem you solve creates a story that spreads. In my time, a satisfied customer might tell 10 people. Today, they can tell 10,000 with a single post. But the principle remains identical. Genuine value creates authentic advocates. I remember a printer in Philadelphia who undercut everyone's prices, trying to grow fast. He got customers initially, but his rushed work created problems. Smeared ink, misaligned pages, broken promises on deadlines. Within a year, he had to leave town because his reputation preceded him everywhere he went. No clever advertisement could overcome the lived experience of disappointed customers. Compare that to another printer that charged premium rates but delivered exceptional work. He wasn't the cheapest option, and he never claimed to be. But what he promised, he delivered every single time. When I needed something done right, I paid his prices gladly. So did everyone else who valued quality over false savings. The most powerful form of reputation building happens in how you handle mistakes. Because you will make them. We all do. The question isn't whether you'll disappoint someone, it's what you do when you inevitably fall short. I once delivered an almanac with an error in the astronomical calculations. A prominent astronomer in Boston wrote me a rather pointed letter about it. I had two choices: defend my error or own it completely. I chose ownership. I published a correction in the next edition, acknowledged the mistake publicly, thanked the astronomer by name, and explained what I'd learned from the error. That single act of humility did more for my reputation than any advertisement could have achieved. People remembered not that I made a mistake, but how I handled it with grace and accountability. Your reputation is built in these moments of truth. When something goes wrong, do you deflect or do you own it? When criticism arrives, do you become defensive or curious? When you fall short, do you make excuses or make it right? The businesses that endure decades aren't those that never make mistakes, they're the ones that turn mistakes into demonstrations of their values. There's a restaurant in Philadelphia, been there over 100 years, that once served a family a meal with undercooked chicken. Dangerous mistake. The health department is worthy. The kind of error that could sink a reputation built over generations. They could have offered a refund, could have blamed a new cook. It could have minimized it with corporate speak about isolated incidents and not representative of our standards. Instead, they closed the restaurant for 3 days, paid every employee their full wages, brought in food safety experts to retrain the entire staff. Then they published a letter not hidden on page 7 of the local paper, but a full-page ad explaining exactly what happened, what they did wrong, and the specific steps they took to ensure it would never happen again. They invited the family back for a meal. Not as a publicity stunt, they asked them not to post about it. Simply as an apology. As humans, we take responsibility for failing other humans. That restaurant is busier today than it was before the incident. Because people don't expect perfection, they expect integrity when imperfection inevitably shows up. I learned something in my years of public service that applies directly to business. The cover-up is always worse than the crime. Always. The moment you choose protecting your image over acknowledging reality, you've started a countdown timer on your credibility. Modern technology has only amplified this truth. There was a time when a business could quietly sweep mistakes under the rug, when dissatisfied customers had limited means to share their experience beyond their immediate circle. Those days are dead and buried. Now every transaction leaves a digital footprint. Every broken promise becomes a potential viral moment. Every choice to hide rather than own becomes public record. This terrifies businesses built on image. But for businesses built on values, it's the greatest advantage imaginable. Because authenticity scales in ways that pretense never can. When your foundation is genuine, you don't have to remember which version of the story you told to which audience. You don't have to maintain elaborate fictions about who you are. You simply tell the truth, do the right thing, and let consistency speak for itself. The beautiful paradox here is that this authenticity actually makes you more influential, not less. People are drawn to those who are comfortable in their own skin. There's a magnetic quality to someone who isn't performing, who isn't calculating every word for maximum impression. I've watched this unfold countless times in Philadelphia's coffeehouses and taverns. The most persuasive person in the room is rarely the loudest or the most polished. It's the one whose words match their actions, whose private character aligns with their public persona. When they speak, people listen not because of rhetorical flourishes, but because there's weight behind the words. This is why I always insisted that the Junto members be people of genuine character. Yes, we discussed philosophy and science and civic improvement. But more importantly, we held each other accountable to live according to our stated principles. We weren't just talking about virtue in the abstract, we were trying to embody it in our daily decisions. And here's what happened. As each of us became more consistent in our own lives, our collective influence grew. We didn't have to campaign for our ideas to spread. They spread because people could see they were real, tested in experience, not just theoretical constructs. The printer who actually paid his debts on time, the merchant who treated his workers fairly, the physician who charged according to ability to pay. These weren't just good people. They were walking advertisements for the principles we espoused. Their lives made the case more powerfully than any pamphlet could. This is the ultimate form of influence, becoming the change you wish to see, so consistently that your very presence shifts what others believe is possible. And it all begins with that sometimes uncomfortable commitment to align what you believe, what you say, and what you do. To close the gap between ideal and reality, not through pretense, but through genuine transformation. When you commit to this path, something remarkable happens. You stop worrying so much about what others think of you, because you know who you are. You develop what I call the confidence of authenticity, a deep, unshakable sense of self-worth that doesn't require constant external validation. This is profoundly different from the brittle arrogance that crumbles at the first sign of criticism. I remember a diplomat I once knew who embodied this principle perfectly. He came from modest beginnings, with nothing distinguished about his family name or his early education, yet he commanded respect in rooms filled with nobility and wealth. How? Because every word he spoke was considered, every promise he made was kept, every principle he claimed to hold was reflected in his actions. People trusted him not because of his title, but because of his character. That's the power of genuine virtue. It creates a gravitational pull that draws people toward you. They may not always agree with you, but they respect you. They may not always like your decisions, but they trust your intentions. Now, here's where this gets truly interesting. As you align your outer life with your inner values, you'll notice that your relationships begin to transform. The shallow connections fall away naturally, not through drama or confrontation, but simply through mutual drift. You stop resonating with people who live on the surface, because you're no longer operating at that frequency. Meanwhile, deeper connections form with those who appreciate authenticity. These are the relationships that sustain you through life's inevitable storms, friends who know your flaws and love you anyway, because they see you genuinely trying to grow beyond them. I found this in my own life. My truest friends weren't those who flattered me or sought advantage through our connection. They were the ones who challenged me, who called me out when I fell short of my own standards, who cared enough about my character to risk my temporary displeasure for my lasting improvement. These are the relationships worth cultivating, and you attract them not by being perfect, but by being real, by showing others that it's safe to be authentic in your presence, because you're not hiding behind a facade yourself. Now, let me tell you about the most counterintuitive discovery I made about relationships and success, something that flies in the face of what most ambitious people believe. I spent years thinking that to succeed, I needed to outwork everyone, outsmart everyone, be the first to arrive and the last to leave. And while dedication matters, I was missing something fundamental. The people who created the most lasting impact weren't always the hardest workers or the most brilliant minds. They were the best connectors. Look at the men who shaped America's founding. George Washington wasn't the most eloquent speaker that was Patrick Henry. He wasn't the deepest political philosopher that was James Madison. He wasn't the most innovative thinker. I'd like to think I held my own there. But Washington had something more valuable. He could bring disparate people together, make them feel heard, and unite them around a common vision. His greatest strength wasn't what he could do alone, but what he could help others do together. I learned this lesson slowly, through repeated humiliation. In my early days in Philadelphia, I'd walk into meetings armed with brilliant arguments, ready to dazzle everyone with my logic and wit. And you know what happened? I'd win the argument and lose the room. People would nod politely and then do exactly what they'd planned to do before I opened my mouth. My rightness didn't create change, it created resentment. So I changed my approach entirely. Instead of declaring my opinions, I began asking questions. What do you think about this? Have you considered that angle? I'm curious about your perspective. This wasn't manipulation, it was genuine humility. I realized that I didn't have all the answers, and that the collective wisdom of the group usually exceeded my individual brilliance. The transformation in my relationships was immediate and profound. People who had previously bristled at my pronouncements now leaned in with interest. They shared ideas they'd never voiced before. They built upon each other's thoughts rather than defending their positions. And here's what shocked me most. The solutions we arrived at together were consistently better than anything I could have conceived alone. There's a particular memory that crystallizes this lesson. We were debating the structure of what would become the Pennsylvania Hospital, the first in America. The old Benjamin would have arrived with architectural plans and fundraising strategies already mapped out. But I came instead with questions. What do our citizens most need? What models have worked elsewhere? What are we missing? Dr. Thomas Bond proposed the medical framework. Others contributed ideas about location, funding, and patient care. I facilitated, questioned, connected dots, but I didn't dominate. The hospital that emerged was infinitely superior to anything I could have designed in isolation. And because everyone had contributed, everyone championed it. The community rallied behind it not as Franklin's project but as our collective achievement. This taught me perhaps the most important leadership lesson of my life. True influence comes not from having all the answers, but from asking the right questions. Not from winning every argument, but from creating space where the best ideas can emerge. Not from proving your intelligence, but from multiplying the intelligence of everyone around you. I began experimenting with this approach everywhere. In the Junto, our discussion club, I shifted from presenting papers to posing dilemmas. In political negotiations, I sought first to understand all perspectives before offering my own. Even in my writing, I adopted a more questioning, exploratory tone rather than the dogmatic certainty of my youth. The results were extraordinary. Projects succeeded, relationships deepened, conflicts resolved. And paradoxically, by diminishing my ego, my actual influence grew exponentially. You see, there's a beautiful irony in humility. The more you diminish yourself, the larger you become in the hearts of others. The less you demand recognition, the more recognition flows toward you. It's like trying to grasp water, clench your fist, and it escapes, but cup your hands gently and it pools naturally. I began noticing this in negotiations. When I stopped needing to be the smartest person in the room, people actually started listening more carefully to what I said. When I presented ideas as questions rather than declarations, others engaged more deeply. What if we considered this approach carries so much more power than, "We must do this"? The French court taught me this beautifully. There I was, a plain-spoken American among powdered wigs and elaborate protocols. I could have asserted my democratic principles aggressively, demanding they see reason immediately. Instead, I listened. I asked questions. I let them teach me about their world before gently introducing mine. And something magical happened. They became curious about this humble printer from Philadelphia. My simple brown coat became more memorable than their silk and satin. My genuine interest in their ideas made them genuinely interested in mine. I influenced an entire royal court not through force of ego, but through the absence of it. Think about the people who've had the deepest impact on your life. Were they the ones constantly reminding you how important they were? Or were they the ones who made times feel important? The ones who truly listened, who admitted mistakes, who asked your opinion, and genuinely considered it. Humility is magnetic because it's so rare. We're surrounded by people broadcasting their achievements, defending their territory, protecting their image. When you encounter someone who doesn't need any of that, who's secure enough to be vulnerable, who's confident enough to be humble, that person stands out like a lighthouse. I'm not suggesting false modesty. That's just pride wearing a mask. I'm talking about genuine humility, the kind that comes from understanding your true place in the vast universe. You're neither worthless nor indispensable. You're a contributor, a participant in something larger than yourself. This perspective freed me tremendously. I could enjoy success without clinging to it. I could weather criticism without being destroyed by it. My worth wasn't tied to being right, being first, or being recognized. I began to see something that changed everything. Humility wasn't weakness, it was freedom. The proud man is a prisoner. He cannot admit mistakes, so he never corrects them. He cannot ask for help, so he struggles alone. He cannot praise others, so he makes enemies of potential allies. He builds a fortress around his ego, and then discovers he has locked himself inside. But the humble man walks through open doors. When I stopped needing to prove myself the smartest person in every room, something remarkable happened. I actually became more effective, because I could listen, I could learn, I could collaborate without constantly competing. I remember a particular incident at the Philadelphia Library Company. A gentleman proposed we acquire a collection of books that I personally thought were inferior choices. The old Benjamin would have demolished his suggestion with wit and reason, would have made him look foolish for even suggesting it. But I had learned better. Instead, I said, "That's an interesting proposal. I wonder if we might also consider these titles alongside yours, so we could compare their merits." I presented my preference not as superior wisdom, but as an additional option worth discussing. The result? We had a genuine conversation. Others joined in. And through that collaborative process, we ended up selecting books that were better than either his original list or mine. The final collection benefited from multiple perspectives, something that never would have happened if I had simply crushed his idea to assert my superiority. This, I realized, was the great paradox. I gained more influence by claiming less. I achieved more by insisting less. I was heard more clearly when I spoke more softly. The truly confident man has nothing to prove. He can afford to be wrong, to change his mind, to say, "I don't know." His worth isn't on trial in every conversation. I had spent my youth trying to be impressive. Now I was learning to be useful instead. And usefulness, I discovered, is what people actually remember. Long after they've forgotten your clever argument, they remember whether you helped them or hindered them. Long after the debate is settled, they remember whether you treated them with respect or contempt. This principle transformed my entire approach to disagreement. Instead of entering conversations with my weapons drawn, looking for weaknesses to exploit, I learned to enter with genuine curiosity about what the other person understood that I didn't. And here's what shocked me. People possess remarkable insights about their own circumstances that no amount of abstract reasoning can match. The printer who seemed to resist new methods often understood practical constraints I'd overlooked. The legislator who opposed my proposal frequently grasped political realities I'd failed to consider. The merchant who dismissed my idea sometimes saw market conditions I hadn't perceived. When you approach disagreement as excavation rather than combat, you discover veins of gold in the most unexpected places. I remember a heated debate about currency policy in Pennsylvania. My initial instinct was to lecture the opposition about economic principles I'd studied. But I paused. I asked questions instead. What were their actual concerns? What had they observed in their businesses? What consequences were they afraid of? Their answers revealed legitimate worries I'd completely missed in my theoretical analysis. They weren't being stubborn or ignorant. They were protecting their livelihoods based on real experiences I'd never had. By incorporating their observations into my proposal, we created a solution far superior to my original idea. This is the profound irony. By setting aside my need to be right, I actually became more effective at reaching good outcomes. By abandoning my attachment to winning arguments, I won more lasting victories for the causes I believed in. The technique works because it addresses a fundamental truth about human nature. We all crave to be understood before we're willing to understand. We all need our concerns acknowledged before we can acknowledge others' concerns. We all require respect before we can offer it freely. When you provide these things first, without demanding reciprocity, you create what I came to think of as a moral opening, a space where genuine dialogue becomes possible. This principle served me remarkably well during the Constitutional Convention. Picture that stifling room in Philadelphia, delegates from 13 sovereign states, each convinced their interests were paramount, each ready to walk away if not satisfied. The large states wanted representation by population. The small states feared annihilation. The southern states had their peculiar institution to protect. The northern states had their commercial interests. I observed something curious in those early deadlocked weeks. Whenever someone proposed a solution, others immediately attacked it, not always because the idea was flawed, but because they hadn't been heard yet. Their grievances were still festering, unexpressed. Their dignity felt threatened. So I began a quiet campaign. In conversations outside the formal sessions, I asked questions. I listened to the Delaware delegate explain his small state's terror of being swallowed. I heard the Virginia delegate's frustration with carrying the financial burden while tiny states had equal say. I acknowledged the South Carolina man's economic reality without endorsing slavery. I validated the Massachusetts merchant's concerns about trade without dismissing the farmer's perspective. Notice what I did not do. I did not solve their problems. I did not immediately counter their arguments. I simply made clear that I understood what they were saying, that their perspective had internal logic, that their concerns were real, even if I disagreed with their conclusions. This created space. When people feel understood, they stop shouting and start thinking. They become capable of listening to others because they're no longer desperately fighting to be heard themselves. The great compromise that saved our convention, representation by population in one house, equality of states in the other, became possible only after this groundwork was laid. It wasn't the brilliance of the idea itself. Similar proposals had been rejected weeks earlier. What changed was the emotional temperature of the room. Once people felt sufficiently heard, they could hear others. Once their dignity was acknowledged, they could compromise without feeling humiliated. This is the quiet power I'm sharing with you. In any conflict, whether negotiating a constitution or resolving a dispute with your neighbor, acknowledgement must precede agreement. Understanding must come before solutions. Respect must be given before it's earned. Now, let me share something that might disturb your modern sensibilities. But it's a truth I learned through decades of political maneuvering. Flattery, when used with precision and sincerity, is not manipulation, it's recognition. You see people today who refuse to compliment others, believing it makes them honest or authentic. What foolishness. Every person carries within them qualities worth acknowledging. The art isn't in inventing virtues they don't possess, that's deception, and it will be discovered. The art is in noticing the genuine strengths they've overlooked in themselves and bringing them into the light. When I negotiated with the French court, I didn't fabricate admiration for their culture. I genuinely studied it. I learned their philosophy, appreciated their art, and understood their contributions to civilization. When I spoke of these things, my words carried weight because they emerged from authentic appreciation. Here's what I discovered. People who are regularly acknowledged for their true strengths become more generous, more cooperative, more willing to compromise. It's not bribery, it's watering the garden of their better nature. Try this tomorrow. Find someone you typically clash with. Before you engage in any negotiation or discussion, identify 3 genuine qualities they possess. Not things you wish they had. Not backhanded compliments. Real strengths. Then, naturally and without agenda, acknowledge one of these. Watch what happens. Watch how their posture changes, how their tone softens, how their defensiveness lowers, like a drawbridge, welcoming a friend rather than preparing for a siege. This isn't a weakness on your part. It's a strategy born of wisdom. And here's the deeper truth. In acknowledging their strengths, you remind yourself that you're not dealing with an enemy. You're dealing with a complex human being who, like you, wants to be seen, understood, and valued. The moment you reduce someone to an obstacle, a problem, or an opponent, you've already lost half the negotiation. You've entered a battle rather than a dialogue. I learned this the hard way in the summer of 1754 at the Albany Congress. I arrived with a vision, a unified colonial defense against the French and their native allies. My plan was solid, logical, and defensible. But I walked into that hall, seeing governors and commissioners as chess pieces I needed to move into position, and they felt it. Every presentation I made was met with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. Not because my ideas were flawed, they weren't, but because I had approached them as problems to solve, rather than partners to engage. I was so focused on the rightness of my position that I forgot about the humanity of theirs. It took a private conversation with Thomas Hutchinson to wake me up. He pulled me aside one evening and said something I've never forgotten. "Benjamin, we all agree with your logic, but you're making us feel foolish for not having thought of it ourselves. You're winning the argument and losing the people." That hit me like a thunderclap. I had spent weeks crafting the perfect union plan, but I had spent zero time considering how it would feel to be on the receiving end of my certainty. I had made them feel diminished rather than elevated. And people will choose their dignity over your logic every single time. So I changed my approach entirely. I started asking questions instead of making declarations. What concerns do you have that I haven't considered? How would you improve this structure? What am I missing? And suddenly the whole dynamic shifted. The plan still didn't pass. Colonial unity wasn't something most were ready for. But the conversations became collaborative rather than combative. People started building on ideas rather than defending against them. They took ownership of elements they had helped shape. That's when I understood. In any negotiation, you're not just negotiating the terms, you're negotiating the relationship itself. And relationships only thrive when both parties feel their humanity is recognized and respected. I learned this principle most powerfully during the Constitutional Convention. Here were 13 states, each convinced its interests were paramount, each threatening to walk away if they didn't get their way. The small states feared being swallowed by the large ones. The southern states worried about northern dominance. The northern states had moral concerns about slavery. Commercial interests clashed with agricultural ones. We could have approached it as a zero-sum game, winners and losers, dominators and dominated. Many wanted to. But that would have given us no nation at all, just a collection of squabbling territories destined to be picked off by European powers one by one. Instead, we built something unprecedented. A framework where competing interests could coexist, where compromise wasn't weakness but wisdom, where the very structure of government acknowledged that no single faction should hold absolute power. The Great Compromise, giving us both proportional representation in one house and equal state representation in another, wasn't anybody's ideal solution. Every delegate sacrificed something they wanted. But everyone gained something more valuable: a union that could actually survive. I watched men who entered that room as adversaries leave as architects of something greater than themselves. Not because they won every argument, but because they were willing to lose some battles to win the war for a functioning republic. The same principle applies to your personal negotiations. When you're discussing a raise with your employer, you're not just negotiating salary. You're negotiating your ongoing relationship, the mutual respect that will make tomorrow's workday either collaborative or contentious. When you're resolving a conflict with your spouse, you're not just settling that particular disagreement. You're either building or eroding the foundation of trust that your marriage rests upon. When you're establishing boundaries with a friend, you're not just addressing the current issue. You're teaching them how to value you and demonstrating how you value them. Every negotiation is a brick in the edifice of your relationships. Lay them with care, with integrity, with respect for both yourself and the other person. Because you're not just building an agreement, you're building a life with these people, whether in business, friendship, family, or community. The best negotiators I've known understood this instinctively. They fought hard for their interests, yes, but never at the expense of the relationship's long-term health. I remember watching two merchants negotiate a shipping partnership in the harbor once. The first haggled brilliantly, squeezed every penny, closed every loophole, walked away with terms that heavily favored him. The second merchant signed reluctantly, face tight with resentment. That partnership lasted exactly one voyage. The contract was perfect. The relationship was poisoned. Compare that to another negotiation I witnessed between a printer and a paper supplier. They went back and forth for hours, yes, but with laughter interspersed. When they hit a sticking point on payment terms, instead of digging in, they asked, "What would make this work for both of us?" They found a creative solution: staggered payments tied to delivery milestones that neither had initially considered. That partnership lasted 30 years and made both men wealthy. The difference? The second pair understood that the agreement was just the beginning. They were negotiating the foundation of a working relationship, not the conclusion of a transaction. This is why I never gloated when I got favorable terms. Why I always looked for ways to help the other party save face, even in victory. A humiliated opponent becomes an enemy. A respected one might become an ally. In the Constitutional Convention, when we finally reached compromises on the most contentious issues, we didn't celebrate by rubbing anyone's nose in their concessions. We acknowledged everyone's contributions. We framed agreements as collective achievements, not victories for one side over another. This wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. We needed these men to go home and champion this document, not sabotage it. Your negotiation ends when you shake hands or sign papers. Your relationship continues long after. Negotiate accordingly. Now, let me share something that took me decades to fully appreciate: the profound power of patience in negotiation. We live in an age, and you certainly do even more, so that worships speed, quick deals, fast decisions, immediate results. But some of the best negotiations I ever conducted moved at the pace of growing seasons, not lightning strikes. I learned to read the rhythms of negotiation like a farmer reads the weather. There's a time to plant ideas, a time to water them with patience, and a time to harvest agreements. Rush the harvest, and the fruit comes in bitter. The French alliance took 2 years of careful cultivation, 2 years of dinners and salons and seemingly idle conversations. My colleagues back home sent impatient letters. When will they commit? When will they sign? They wanted me to demand, to push, to force a decision. But I understood something they didn't. The French court didn't respond to pressure, they responded to inevitability. My job wasn't to convince them to help us. My job was to let them convince themselves that helping us served their interests perfectly. So, I planted stories. I let slip always accidentally. You understand how much progress we were making, how the British were struggling, how other European powers were watching with interest. I created the impression of a tide they could either ride or be swept away by. Each dinner party was a seed. Each philosophical discussion was gentle rain. Each demonstration of American resilience was sunshine warming the soil. And when the harvest finally came, when they finally offered us everything we needed, they believed it had been their idea all along. That's the power of patience in negotiation. It transforms your agenda into their inspiration. The same principle worked in countless smaller dealings. When I needed the French postal system to accept our mail, I didn't demand it in a formal meeting. I mentioned the problem casually to a postal official at a reception. Then I mentioned it to his superior at a different event. Then I wrote a charming essay about communication binding nations together and made sure it circulated in the right circles. 6 months later, the policy changed. No confrontation, no formal negotiation, just patient cultivation of an idea until it bloomed on its own. Your generation calls this playing the long game. We called it wisdom. The recognition that not every problem requires an immediate solution, that some victories are won by outlasting rather than overpowering your opposition. I watch modern negotiators treat every discussion like a sprint when they should be running a marathon. They exhaust themselves and their counterparts in the first mile, then wonder why nothing gets across the finish line. I learned this patience not from books, but from watching Benjamin rush the printing of a pamphlet before the ink was properly mixed, ruining an entire run. From observing how a stone foundation must cure before you build upon it, or the whole structure cracks come winter. Nature doesn't hurry, yet everything gets accomplished in its season. The fourth mistake, and this one pains me, particularly because it stems from good intentions, is confusing fairness with equality. They sound similar, don't they? But they're as different as justice and revenge, though both claim to balance scales. I see negotiators bent on dividing everything 50-50, as if precise mathematical equality were the same as equitable resolution. They spend hours arguing over pennies to maintain perfect proportion, missing entirely that the parties don't value all items equally. True fairness recognizes that you might care deeply about something I find trivial, and vice versa. The skilled negotiator identifies these differences and builds agreements that give each party what matters most to them. During the Constitutional Convention, we could have insisted each state receive exactly equal representation in all things perfect equality. Instead, we created a dual system, proportional representation in one house, equal representation in the other. Was it exactly fair? Depends on who you ask. But it worked because it addressed what each side fundamentally needed rather than what abstract equality demanded. I watch business partners destroy profitable relationships, arguing over exact equity percentages when one primarily wants creative control and the other wants financial return. Both could leave satisfied if they stopped treating every element as equally important to both parties. The obsession with mathematical equality often produces outcomes where everyone gets exactly half of what they don't particularly want. And here's the wisdom that comes hard. Sometimes fairness means acknowledging that life itself isn't fair, and our negotiated agreements need not pretend otherwise. If you're negotiating from a position of genuine strength, you need not apologize for it, but neither should you abuse it if you hope to deal with these people again tomorrow. If you're negotiating from weakness, don't demand equality you can't enforce. Instead, seek terms you can live with while you build toward better circumstances. The fairest agreement isn't the one that looks most equal on paper. It's the one both parties willingly uphold afterward.